Hello, I'm doing a DVD collection video, and in this video I'm going to talk about my favorite horror movies that came out in the 1970s. The first movie I want to talk about is Equinox, which came out in 1970. Now, Equinox is actually co-directed by one of the people who would go on to do effects work for movies like Star Wars and Jurassic Park, and, and I actually first saw this movie when I was like 8 or 9 years old. I actually saw it on AMC, because AMC, they used to have this show every Friday night that was actually hosted by Stan Winston, where they would show like all these B-movies, and Stan Winston would give like kind of an introduction to them, and that's where I first saw this movie. Now, the plot of the movie is a group of teenagers or young adults go out into the woods looking for this college professor that they know, and it turns out the professor was messing around with this book that could summon demons, and what happens is it turns out that the demons now start pursuing these teenagers, and there's also this park ranger, or what appears to be a park ranger, who you find out in the movie is actually the devil in human form. It's a really fun movie. Like, I can't say the acting in the movie is that good, but the film is definitely a very fun movie. Like, the film definitely has a charm to it, and some of the stop-motion effects for, like, the demons in the movie is actually really, really good. It's a very fun B-movie. I would definitely recommend it, and apparently this is one of the things that, The Evil Dead was actually inspired by, and you could definitely tell that watching the movie. It does have a very Evil Dead kind of premise to it, and the film is also produced by Jack H. Harris, who also produced The Blob. But yeah, that's Equinox. The next movie I want to talk about is The Wizard of Gore, which is directed by Herschell Gordon Lewis. Now, Herschell Gordon Lewis is often called the godfather of gore. Now, the film is about a magician who does this act where he kills people on stage, but makes it look like it's an illusion because they appear to be normal afterwards, but later on they end up dead. The Wizard of Gore, I haven't seen it in a while, but I remember it being a really good movie. But yeah, that's The Wizard of Gore. The next movie I want to talk about is Bay of Blood, which also goes by the title A Twitch of the Death Nerve. Now, Bay of Blood is an Italian giallo film directed by Italian filmmaker Mario Bava, and I actually have this movie on this collection of Mario Bava films, but Bay of Blood is a pretty interesting movie. Basically, it begins with this old lady who owns this bay is murdered by her husband, but then her husband gets murdered by an unseen killer, and what happens is, like, in the movie, you don't know who this killer is, but pretty much everybody in the movie could be a suspect, because pretty much every character in this movie is a complete sleazebag. Like, you have this greedy real estate agent and his lover who are trying to take control of the bay. Like, then you have the daughter of this old woman who was murdered, her and her husband are trying to get, like, ownership of the bay. It's just every character in the film is just sleazy and seedy as fuck, so pretty much anybody could be the killer, but it's a very fun movie. Bay of Blood is a movie I definitely recommend, especially if you're into Italian horror films. And also, a lot of the death scenes in this movie were actually remade in Friday the 13th Part 2. Like, there's a scene in this movie where a couple is having sex, and the killer comes in and shoves a spear right through them while they're having sex, and that scene was pretty much remade almost shot by shot for Friday the 13th Part 2. The next movie I want to talk about is The Omega Man, starring Charlton Heston. Now, The Omega Man is about a man-made virus which breaks out and pretty much wipes out the entire human population, but there was this scientist named Robert Neville, played by Charlton Heston, who made a vaccine, but he only had enough of it to inject into himself, and pretty much the virus wiped out everybody on the planet, with a select few people still living, but it turns out all the other survivors are still infected, and basically the infected survivors have also gone crazy and have formed this religious cult who call themselves the Family, and now they're going after Robert Neville because they have banned all machinery, but they see that Robert Neville still uses machinery, so they're going after him because they pretty much think he's like the devil. But The Omega Man is a film that I really enjoy. Now, this is, of course, very loosely based on the Richard Matheson novel I Am Legend, but of course it's only very loosely based because in the book I Am Legend, the villains were vampires, but in this film they're obviously not vampires, they're actually just a religious cult. But The Omega Man, it's a very enjoyable film. It is a little cheesy, but it's still definitely a very fun film, and I would definitely recommend it. The next movie I want to talk about is a film that most people would probably not consider to be a horror film, but the thing about this movie is it's a movie that kind of defies classification, and that film is A Clockwork Orange, which is of course directed by Stanley Kubrick and based on the novel by Anthony Burgess. Now, I have read the novel that this movie is based on. Now, A Clockwork Orange, the thing about this movie is, like I said, it kind of defies genre because it could be considered a horror film, it could be considered a drama film, it could be considered a black comedy, it could be considered a science fiction movie, it could be considered a political satire. Like, it seems to just kind of defy genre, but A Clockwork Orange is set in the future, and basically in the future, juvenile delinquency is at an all-time high, and what happens is the film follows this demented kid named Alex who ends up getting arrested, and basically the government tries this brainwashing experiment on him, and that's really all I want to say about the plot line of this movie. But A Clockwork Orange, of course, is a great movie, and in the film, Malcolm McDowell plays the character of Alex, who has been considered one of the greatest movie villains of all time, pretty much, even though some people might look at him as more of an anti-hero than a villain. But yeah, that's A Clockwork Orange. The next movie I want to talk about is a movie that I don't have on DVD, however, it is a film that I have seen quite a few times, and that movie is Duel from 1971. Now, Duel is based on a short story by Richard Matheson, and this was actually a made-for-TV movie originally, but it was later re-released in the theaters, and the film is actually directed by Steven Spielberg. And of course, we all know who Steven Spielberg is. So the plot of Duel is it's about this man who's being chased by this psychopath driving a huge, like, diesel truck, and you never find out who this guy is or why he's chasing this man. But I think that's what makes the movie so effective, is the fact that you don't know who this truck driver is or why he's doing what he's doing. And it's a very simple story, but I think thanks to Steven Spielberg's directing and Richard Matheson's writing, you get a very effective movie, in my opinion. The next movie I want to talk about is the original Willard from 1971. Now, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think this movie is available on an official DVD yet. At least I don't think so. If it is, correct me if I'm wrong, but this DVD that I have is not really an official DVD because I got this at a horror convention, and this is actually a kind of like a bootleg, but Willard is a really good movie, and this of course was remade in 2003 with Crispin Glover playing the character of Willard. But the original Willard is definitely a classic. Basically, it's about this young man named Willard who works for this company that was actually started by his father, but his boss ended up stealing the company away from him, and now his boss treats him like complete garbage. And what happens is one day he finds all these rats in his backyard, and instead of killing them, he actually becomes friends with them and starts training them, and somehow he's able to control the rats, and he ends up using the rats to get revenge on his boss. Willard is a really good movie. I would definitely recommend it, and it might come off like your typical like killer rat kind of movie, but it's actually more of a psychological thriller, but it's a very good movie. I would definitely recommend Willard. And I also recommend the sequel to Willard, Ben. Now, Ben is more of your typical B-movie, like a typical killer rat kind of movie, while the first one was definitely a psychological thriller. This is more of a B-movie, but Ben is still definitely a really entertaining movie. Now, there was actually a song written for this movie called Ben, which was actually performed by Michael Jackson, and Michael Jackson's song Ben was actually nominated for an Academy Award for this movie for, like, Best Original Song. But yeah, Ben I would definitely recommend, and I would also recommend the first one, Willard. The next movie I want to talk about is The Abominable Dr. Phibes. Now, this is a horror comedy starring Vincent Price. It's basically about this mad scientist who was horribly disfigured in a car accident, and it turns out that a few years earlier his wife died. I think she was like sick or something, and these doctors were doing surgery on her, but she ended up dying, so Dr. Phibes blames these doctors for his wife's death, and he ends up taking revenge on each of them by killing each of them off one by one. But the way he kills them is inspired by the 10 plagues of Egypt from the Old Testament, and this is a horror comedy, like I just said. Now, I first saw this movie when I was a little kid, and when I was a little kid, I didn't notice, like, the humor in the movie. To me, it was just a horror film, but as I got older and saw this movie again, you know, I realized how funny the film actually is, and it is actually a really funny movie. I would definitely recommend The Abominable Dr. Phibes, and I also recommend the sequel, Dr. Phibes Rises Again, which also has Vincent Price in it. Both of these are very fun movies. I would definitely recommend both of them. The next movie I want to talk about is The Gore Girls from 1972. Now, this is directed by Herschel Gordon Lewis, and basically this is about a killer who's killing all these strippers at a strip club off one by one, and this is actually a really gross movie. Like, there's a scene in this movie where the killer actually slices off this woman's nipples, and all this breast milk comes spurting out, and there's also a scene where the killer literally turns this woman's face inside out. It's definitely not a movie I would recommend eating while you're watching, but it is a fun movie. I would recommend it, but it is a gross movie too, but that's The Gore Girls. The next movie I want to talk about is the original Tales from the Crypt from 1972, which I have both on VHS and I have it on DVD. Now, of course, this is based on the EC comic books from the 1950s, but this was the first adaptation of those comic books. Of course, in the 80s, they would be made into the TV series Tales from the Crypt, but the original Tales from the Crypt is definitely one of my favorites, and it also had a sequel called The Vault of Horror, which I have on the same DVD as Tales from the Crypt, and The Vault of Horror I also would recommend as well. Both of these are really good films. The next movie I want to talk about is Beware the Blob. This movie also goes by the title Son of the Blob, and this is actually directed by Larry Hagman, and basically this is a sequel to the original The Blob from 1958. But this is a really fun movie. I always enjoyed this film myself, but yeah, that's Beware the Blob. The next movie I want to talk about is Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left. Now, this is the original The Last House on the Left. Of course, there was a remake to this, which came out a few years ago, but this was also Wes Craven's first movie. Now, The Last House on the Left is about these two girls who are kidnapped by this gang of escaped criminals, and they end up taking these two girls out into the woods and basically raping and killing them. But then the parents of one of these two girls ends up taking revenge on these criminals. It's a really fun movie. Well, I shouldn't say it's a fun movie, because there's some really horrific scenes in this movie, but the thing about this movie is there's a lot of, like, humor in the film, and the film jumps back and forth between being really, really serious and then being, like, goofy as hell, which kind of adds to the movie. I know a lot of people do not like this movie because of that, but to me, that's one of the reasons why I like it, because of how kind of schizo the movie is. Like, one minute there are really horrific scenes where these criminals are torturing these poor girls, and then it jumps to these, like, two lame cops who are looking for the criminals, who are done for, like, comic relief. It's such a weird movie, but I enjoy the film, even though I can get why people don't like this movie. But yeah, that's The Last House on the Left. The next movie I want to talk about is The Other. Now, this is actually directed by the same guy who directed To Kill a Mockingbird, but this is about these two brothers. One appears to be good and one appears to be evil, but there is a twist in the movie, and I will admit you can kind of see the twist coming, but it's still a good movie. I would definitely recommend The Other. It's definitely a very psychological movie, like a psychological horror film, but The Other, it's a film I would definitely recommend. The next movie I want to talk about is actually a movie that my dad would always tell me about. This is a movie that my dad saw when he was a kid, and he said this scared the shit out of him when he was a little kid, and he would always tell me about this movie when I was younger. But when I was 13 years old, my aunt ended up getting me this box set called Chilling Classics, which is a box set featuring 50 different horror movies, and I've shown this box set before in a few of my other DVD collection videos, but the movie I want to talk about is a film called Horror Express, which came out in 1972 and stars Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, and Telly Savalas, and this is a really, really good movie. Like, it's a very underrated movie in my opinion. Like, I don't know how many people really know about this movie, but it's a really good movie. Like, Horror Express, it's a film I would definitely recommend. Basically, it's set on a train, and it's about this professor played by Christopher Lee who found the fossil of this prehistoric half-man, half-ape-like creature, but what happens is, while it's on the train being transported from Asia to Europe, the creature comes to life and starts killing people on the train, and, like, if you look into its red eye, it will drain you of your soul, mind, and memory. And it turns out that this ape-like creature is actually possessed by an alien entity. It's a really good movie. I definitely recommend Horror Express. The next movie I want to talk about is yet another movie I have on the Chilling Classics box set, and that movie is called Messiah of Evil. Now, Messiah of Evil came out in 1972, and basically it's about a young woman who is looking for her father, and she comes to this small town in, I think, California, I believe, or, yeah, I think it's California, and what happens is it turns out that there's something not right about this town at all. It turns out that the people in this town, or at least it appears that these people are being possessed by some kind of an evil force. But it's a really creepy movie, and it's also a very surreal kind of movie, and almost kind of an artsy kind of movie as well, but it's a film I definitely recommend, Messiah of Evil. Evil, and it's in the public domain, so you could find it on any of these, like, public domain box sets like this, or you might even be able to watch it online, actually, since it is in the public domain. Just type in Messiah of Evil full movie, and you should be able to find it. But Messiah of Evil, I definitely recommend. The next movie I want to talk about is Don't Look Now. Now, Don't Look Now is about this couple whose daughter previously died, and what happens is they end up going to Venice, and they meet these two old women, and one of the women claims that she's a psychic, and what happens is, in the film, Donald Sutherland's character starts seeing this figure in a red coat going around the city, and when his daughter died, his daughter was wearing a red coat, so he starts to think maybe this is the ghost of his daughter, but at the same time, there's also a killer going around the city killing people. But Don't Look Now, it's a really good movie. I would definitely recommend it. The next movie I want to talk about is the original It's Alive. And It's Alive, this is a really fun movie. It's a very cheesy movie, but it's still a very fun movie, though. But basically, It's Alive, it's about this woman who gives birth to a monster baby, and it's implied that she gave birth to it because of all the pollution in the atmosphere. Like, it's kind of like one of those films with environmental messages saying, like, don't fuck with Mother Nature or she'll kick our asses, pretty much. But yeah, It's Alive, it's a fun movie. I would definitely recommend it, and this spawned a couple of sequels. Well, only 2 sequels, but they also made a remake to this movie, but dear God, avoid the remake at all costs. But the original It's Alive is a film I would recommend. The next movie I want to talk about is a movie like Horror Express. It's a movie that my dad always used to tell me about when I was younger, because this is a movie that my dad saw when he was a little kid, and he said this scared the shit out of him when he was a little kid. So it's a movie that I've always been interested in seeing, and a few short years ago, we ended up getting the movie on DVD, and that movie is Don't Be Afraid of the Dark. Now, this is a 1973 made-for-TV movie, and there was a remake made to this a few short years ago with Katie Holmes in it, but basically, the original Don't Be Afraid of the Dark is about this young woman who moves into this house with her husband, and there's a fireplace in the house which is all sealed off with bricks, and this old man warns her not to open up the fireplace, but of course she does, and it turns out the fireplace is actually the gateway to hell, and all these little demons come out of the fireplace, and now they're trying to drag her to hell. But the original Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, it is a little corny because the little demons do look a little cheesy, but if you actually watch this movie under the right circumstances, it's actually a pretty freaking creepy movie. But yeah, I definitely recommend the original Don't Be Afraid of the Dark. The remake was alright, but you know, the original one, if you like made-for-TV movies from the 70s, I think you would definitely like this one. But yeah, that's Don't Be Afraid of the Dark. Now, I'm going to end this video off here, and I'm going to continue with a part 2, so stay tuned for part 2, and bye.